My name is Charlotte, and if you've ever felt like the invisible child in your own family, then you already know how my story begins. I grew up with one sibling, my older brother Daniel. From the moment we were kids, the sun seemed to rise and set with him. My parents praised him for everything, his sports trophies, his grades, even the way he smiled. To them, Daniel could do no wrong. And me? Well, I was the other one. Don't get me wrong, I worked hard. In fact, I often did better than Daniel in school. Straight A's, honors classes, scholarships. I was the kid who studied late into the night, who got her first job at 16, who helped around the house without being asked. But compared to my brother, none of that mattered. If Daniel brought home a B on a test, my parents would cheer. At least you tried, honey. If I brought home an A, it was just expected. No fuss, no pride. I can't tell you how many times people outside our family noticed it too. Teachers would say, "Wow, Charlotte, you're really excelling." Meanwhile, my parents would jump in to talk about Daniel's baseball team, how he was really going places. I learned early on to smile through it, even when it hurt. But the favoritism only grew stronger as we got older. When Daniel got into college, my parents paid for everything. Tuition, books, housing, you name it. They called it an investment in his future. When it was my turn, I was told that since I had a scholarship, I didn't need their help. Never mind the fact that my scholarship didn't cover everything. I still had to work 2 jobs to afford food, rent, and books. I'd hear Daniel calling home, asking for extra money, and within hours my parents would send it. When I called to tell them I'd skipped meals just to pay rent, my mom sighed and said, "You're resilient, Charlotte. You'll figure it out." And I did figure it out. I always did. But deep down, the resentment started building. By the time Daniel and I were both adults, it wasn't even subtle anymore. Family dinners revolved around his life, his job, his promotions, his girlfriend. Whenever I tried to share something about myself, the conversation would shift right back to him. It was like my words just floated into the air and disappeared. And then came the day that changed everything. It was Thanksgiving, a holiday that had always been bittersweet for me. I loved the idea of family gathering together, but I dreaded the way my parents used it as another stage to brag about Daniel. That year, though, my parents said they had something special planned. After dinner, when the dishes were cleared and everyone was sitting around the living room, my dad stood up with 2 envelopes in his hand. "Your mother and I wanted to give you both something meaningful," he said, smiling warmly at Daniel first. "Something to help you start the next chapter of your lives." He handed the first envelope to my brother. Daniel opened it, and as soon as he pulled out the papers, his face lit up. "A house," he said, his voice full of shock and delight. "That's right," my mom beamed. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, fully paid off. "It's yours." Everyone clapped. Everyone cheered. Daniel stood, hugging them, thanking them over and over again. I forced a smile, clapping along, even as my chest tightened. Then it was my turn. My dad handed me the second envelope. I opened it, my fingers trembling with hope, desperate to feel like I mattered too. Inside was a single lottery ticket. Not even a stack. Just one. For a moment, I thought it was a joke. I laughed nervously, waiting for them to pull out something real. But my mom chuckled and said, "Well, you always like surprises, Charlotte." Daniel smirked, waving the deed to his house in the air. "Hey, maybe you'll get lucky," he teased. Everyone laughed. Except me. I swallowed the lump in my throat, pretending to be amused. But inside, I felt like they had just slapped me across the face. That night, when I got home, I sat on my bed staring at the ticket. I couldn't shake the thought, this is all they think I'm worth. A chance. A gamble. 4 days, I left it on my nightstand. I couldn't bring myself to scratch it. Every time I looked at it, I felt small and visible. Like my entire childhood had been boiled down into one cruel symbol. Then one Friday night, after an exhausting shift at work, I picked up the coin and scratched. At first, I thought my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. I blinked, rubbed my face, and looked again. My hand started shaking. My heart pounded, so hard I thought it would burst. The numbers lined up. I had won. Not 100. Not 1,000. Not even 1,000,000. $134 million. I gasped, nearly dropping the ticket. My whole body went cold and hot at the same time. I laughed. I cried. I paced my room like a madwoman. This can't be real, I whispered. But it was. For the first time in my life, the universe had handed me something extraordinary. Something mine. Something no one could take away. But instead of running to tell my parents, I kept it a secret. I wanted to see, for once, how they treated me when they thought I had nothing. And what I saw in the weeks that followed only proved everything I had felt my whole life. When you win $134 million, you'd think the first feeling would be pure joy. And for a while it was. I couldn't stop smiling, couldn't stop whispering. Finally I matter. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something dark. My family had never truly seen me. They had never valued me for who I was. And deep down I knew, if I told them about the money, it wouldn't change anything. It would only make them greedy. So I stayed quiet. For weeks, life carried on. Daniel hosted dinners in his brand new house, showing off the walk-in closets, the backyard, the marble countertops. My parents beamed with pride every time they stepped inside. And me, I sat at the table, eating politely, while they asked me questions like, "So, Charlotte, when are you going to get a better job? You can't be living paycheck to paycheck forever." I smiled and said nothing, gripping the secret in my pocket. Then came Christmas. That was the night everything started to unravel. We gathered again at Daniel's house, twinkling lights, fancy decorations, champagne glasses lined up on the counter. Daniel stood at the head of the table, raising his glass. "Here's to family, blessings, and maybe one day Charlotte will catch up." Everyone laughed. Everyone except me. My chest burned with anger. But instead of lashing out, I decided it was time. Time to show them exactly what their joke had turned into. I stood up, my hands steady even though my heart pounded. I reached into my bag, pulled out the lottery ticket, and placed it in the center of the table. "This," I said quietly, "is what you gave me." My mom tilted her head, confused. My dad squinted. Daniel smirked. "You're still carrying that around," he chuckled. I looked him dead in the eye. "Yes, because this ticket made me a multimillionaire." Silence. Complete silence. My mom's wine glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. My dad's face went pale. Daniel blinked, then burst out laughing. "Good one, Charlotte. You almost had me." But when I didn't laugh, his smile faltered. He leaned forward. "Wait, you're serious?" I nodded. My mom gasped, clutching her chest. My dad stammered, "You're joking, right? That can't be true." Daniel's face twisted. He forced a laugh again, but it was shaky. "Well, we're family. That means we'll share, right?" That sentence, "we'll share," was the first crack in the mask. It didn't take long for their true colors to spill out. Within days, my mom was calling me every morning. "Sweetheart, you should move back in with us. That way, we can help you manage this money. It's a lot for someone like you. Someone like me." My dad started sending me financial articles, hinting that I should put him in charge of overseeing investments. And Daniel, he suddenly became my best friend, texting me constantly, inviting me over, telling me about all the things we could do with that kind of money. But none of it was genuine. I saw the hunger in their eyes, the way they spoke to me as if I were a bank account instead of their daughter or their sister. One night, Daniel even showed up at my apartment uninvited. He leaned against the doorframe, trying to look casual, but his eyes were sharp. "You know, Charlotte," he said, "you wouldn't even have that ticket if it wasn't for Mom and Dad giving it to you. Technically, you kind of owe them. And me." I stared at him, my blood boiling. "Oh, you." He smirked. "Yeah, think about it. You wouldn't want to be selfish. We're family." That was the moment the betrayal cut the deepest. Because it wasn't just about the money. It was about realizing they had never cared for me, not really. To them, I had always been less. And now that I had something they wanted, suddenly I was valuable. But not as Charlotte, not as a daughter, not as a sister, just as a ticket. And that's when something inside me shifted. I stopped crying over the favoritism. I stopped wishing they'd love me the way I love them. Instead, I began to plan. If they saw me as nothing more than a lottery ticket, then I'd teach them what happens when you gamble and lose. For weeks after Christmas, my phone never stopped buzzing. At first, it was my mom with her syrupy voice. "Charlotte, Honey, I've been thinking, maybe you should let us help. You're young, you've never managed this kind of money before. Your father and I could guide you. The next day, it was my dad. I know some great financial guys. If you want, I'll set up a meeting. Of course, I'd sit in. Make sure no one takes advantage of you. And Daniel, his messages were the worst. We should invest together. You know, it wouldn't kill you to help me renovate the house. Mom and Dad gave you that ticket, you know. Technically, it's kind of theirs too. Every word felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Because all my life, I had wanted their approval, their pride, their love. And now that I finally had something they couldn't ignore, it wasn't me they loved, it was the money. I can't lie, I cried. A lot. I'd sit in my little apartment, staring at that glowing lottery check, and I'd ask myself, why me? Why now? Why can't they just be happy for me instead of trying to take it away? There were moments when I almost gave in. When the little girl in me whispered, if you share with them, maybe they'll finally love you. But then I'd hear Daniel's voice in my head, technically you owe us. And just like that, the tears would dry. Because I realized something I should have understood a long time ago. Love that comes with conditions isn't love at all. So I stopped picking up their calls. I stopped answering their texts. I shut my phone off at night just to get some peace. But even as I tried to protect myself, a part of me burned with something darker than sadness. Anger. All those years of being the forgotten child. All the times they brushed off my achievements, dismissed my struggles, laughed at my dreams. And now this attempt to guilt me into handing over what was mine. It wasn't just unfair. It was cruel. And for the first time in my life, I thought, maybe it's my turn to teach them a lesson. The idea started small. A flicker. What if I gave them a taste of their own medicine? What if I showed them what it felt like to be treated as less than? The more I thought about it, the more it grew. Until it wasn't just an idea anymore. It was a plan. I started with Daniel. One evening, he called again, asking me to lend him money to expand his garage. This time, I agreed to meet him in person. We sat in his brand new living room, him bragging about his latest purchases, acting like he was already entitled to my winnings. So, he said, leaning back with a smug smile, how much are you going to help me with? I tilted my head, feigning innocence. Help you? He chuckled. Come on, Charlotte. Be serious. You can't possibly need all that money. You've always been practical. You'll do the right thing. The right thing. I smiled sweetly and said, you're right, Daniel. I will. His eyes lit up. So you'll write me a check? I leaned forward, lowering my voice. No. The right thing is finally putting myself first. The way his face fell, it was like watching glass shatter. That was step one, showing him that his golden child charm no longer worked on me. Next was my parents. I invited them over to my apartment one Saturday afternoon. They walked in, already talking about how unsafe my neighborhood was, how I should really move closer to them. I served them tea, sat them down, and let them ramble about all the ways they could support me with the money. Then I dropped the bomb. I've decided to hire professionals. A legal team, financial advisors, an accountant. They'll be managing everything. My mom blinked. But sweetheart, we're your parents. You don't need strangers when you have us. I sipped my tea, calm and steady. Actually, that's exactly why I need strangers. Because they'll see me for who I am, not just for what I can give them. The silence that followed was thick. And that was when I knew I wasn't just protecting myself anymore. I was making them face the truth. But I wasn't done. See, revenge doesn't always have to be loud. Sometimes the quietest moves cut the deepest. So I began to plan each step carefully. The inheritance decisions, the public announcements, the little ways I'd make it clear that the invisible child had become untouchable. At night, I'd lie awake, my mind racing. Part of me still longed for love, for acceptance. But another part, the stronger part, whispered, they made you invisible. Now make yourself unforgettable. And with $134 million in my corner, I had the power to do it. I waited. I let them come to me with their greed and their assumptions, and I watched them reveal themselves with every phone call, every concerned visit, every offhand comment about family obligations. They thought I was fragile. They thought I would cave. They had no idea how carefully I'd been building. First, I legally armored myself. I hired a real estate attorney, not some cheap consult, but a woman named Marisol who wore her experience like a shield. I signed the ticket into a trust. Not some shady setup to hide money, everything above board, documented and audited. The funds were placed in accounts under fiduciary control, with specific clauses for my children's education, medical trusts, and charitable endowments. The trust language was precise. No loans to family without board approval, no unilateral gifts, and a mandatory cooling-off period before any family member could receive discretionary funds. When Daniel's smug text arrived, "So when are we getting that deposit?" I smiled and sent a copy of the trust terms. His message went from cocky to choke in the span of a single read. That was the quiet power move, and it needed to be first. I wasn't trying to hurt them with money, I was protecting myself. I knew the minute I announced anything without controls, the vultures would circle. But that didn't mean I wouldn't use that protection as leverage. Second, I rebuilt my narrative. For years, I'd played the underappreciated daughter who smiled and cleaned up after everyone. That image worked for them because they were the stars and I was the background. I started showing up in the foreground. Not with bravado, not with cheap theatrics, but with intention. I enrolled in a financial literacy program because I wanted to understand the language of money and to be credible. I met with philanthropic advisors and sketched a vision for a foundation dedicated to helping students like me pay for college without parental strings attached. I told a very small circle, 2 trusted friends and Marisol. The rest I let imagine what they wanted, because imagination will do half your work for you. People started to see me not as a punchline, but as a force. Then came the social moves, exactly public enough to sting but legally clean. I didn't broadcast my wealth like a reality show. I seeded narratives. I donated anonymously to the scholarship fund at the community college where I'd worked a part-time job. I sponsored a small reading corner at the public library under a pseudonym that sounded like it belonged to a serious patron. People talked, of course. "Who's the mystery donor?" they whispered. My parents heard. Daniel heard. They couldn't gleefully talk about their generosity while a stranger's plaque quietly outshone their name on the community boards. Of course they tried to manipulate me. My mother called, begging, "Sweetheart, you don't have to do this alone. Think of the family." My father sent me a check, $3,000, so small it looked like a hint rather than support, along with a letter about responsibility. Daniel offered investments, business plans, proposals. I listened, politely, and then I set small tests. When Daniel proposed that we pool funds to renovate his house into a family compound, I asked for a formal business plan and third-party quotes. He handed me something that smelled of napkin math and entitlement. I smiled and forwarded it to the financial advisor on my trust board with a note. "Please review, I'm considering." Within 48 hours, a professional assessment returned with cold numbers showing project costs, liens, and risks. Daniel called me, voice tight. "You don't have to make this difficult, Char." I said, "I'm not making it difficult. I'm just doing my due diligence." The lullaby of his charm finally lost its tune. Then came the theater I'd planned for months. I knew people often react to optics more than truth. If I wanted to rewrite the family story, I had to change how the town perceived us. The first public headline I allowed was small and purposeful: "Local alum donates to scholarship fund." A modest piece in the neighborhood paper, a quote from a former teacher praising my courage and tenacity. My parents clipped the article, read it aloud at dinner, and made a show of pride. I let them bask for one dinner. Then, just when they were comfortable again, I made an even bolder move. I organized a gala, not a glittering billionaire affair, but a community fundraiser for the educational foundation I'd created. I invited neighbors, teachers, and a few local journalists. Daniel offered to co-host, proud as a peacock. He floated the fact that families should stick together and that sharing is important. I let him take the stage first. He spoke about community, then pivoted into his own success story. People applauded politely. When it was my turn, I stood, looked at the room, and spoke slow, deliberate sentences about being the daughter people forgot but who refused to be forgotten. I introduced the scholarship winners, spoke softly about the night I worked 2 jobs and almost dropped out. I let the moms and dads in the room see me fully. But the real curtain drop? The silent auction. I'd arranged for several donors to submit anonymized bids for a mystery donation. A well-known conservative donor, someone who'd always laughed off my parents' claims of investment acumen, publicly pledged a matching grant against any scholarship fund donations over that evening's total. The match was sizable. Cameras were there, the local food blogger wrote a warm piece, and the entire community watched me transform from the girl with the scratch-off ticket into a serious philanthropic figure. The photographs from that night circulated. My mother posted one to her social feed with the caption, "So proud of Charlotte tonight." But she didn't tag the anonymous donor who effectively doubled my impact. She'd been given a public role. Her credit had to be earned, and she didn't know that yet. As the months progressed, the pressure changed shape. My family stopped hinting and started demanding. Dad wanted to be on the advisory board of the foundation. Mom wanted first refusal rights on decisions about family charities. Daniel, ever creative, proposed a family partnership that would allow me to leverage my wealth to get better mortgage terms for his next venture. I refused each politely but firmly. I held copies of financial statutes and fiduciary responsibilities in my pocket like talismans. "We'll consider your input," I'd say, "but the trustees have final approval." That phrase, "the trustees have final approval," sanitized their hope and left them to squirm in their entitlement. Anger turned to scheming. I'm not proud of how accurately I could catalog petty grievances and then weaponize them emotionally. I did something childish and devastating because it was the only language they seemed to understand. I bought Daniel's newly built house next door. Not to gloat, not to stalk, but because I wanted him to feel the absence of privacy he'd been so comfortable imposing on me my whole life. I renovated the place with care, planting a row of birch trees that would grow as tall as privacy demanded. When the papers ran the story, a neutral headline about a local entrepreneur expanding her portfolio, Daniel's pride cratered into thin silence. He walked past one Sunday and stopped on the porch, staring. "You're ridiculous," he muttered. I waved, like a neighbor greeting a neighbor, and he hated that I'd made him feel small. The next layer of revenge was reputational and, frankly, delicious. For years, my parents had bragged about family values while quietly trimming support when it wasn't convenient. I started asking public questions at PDA meetings and neighborhood association events with a soft voice of concern. Has anyone considered transparency for the scholarship funds? I'd ask, how are vendors chosen for community galas? These were routine-sounding questions, but once people had been primed with whispers of irregularities, the questions grew legs. Board members who once nodded politely now called for audits. Vendors who'd won contracts without bids suddenly found themselves on review lists. My parents, who had always smiled at my principled questions, had to field awkward calls from other committee members. I saw my mother's smile falter for the first time. But I wasn't going to stop at social exposure. I'd learned the hard lesson that money without structure gets stolen. So I created structures that made sure everything was above board and visible. I invited independent auditors for all the foundation's accounts. I set up a public dashboard showing how every dollar was used. That transparency meant anyone who had hoped to siphon funds through favor or friendship found it much harder to do so. When my father tried to push for a vendor he liked, one that did favors for him, the board declined. My father called, voice strained. "They resent you." I replied quietly, "They resent corruption, Dad. They don't resent me." There was a silence, and in it, a tiny surrender. One of the nastiest moves they tried was emotional manipulation via the kids. Daniel suggested codenamed family experiences, where he'd arrange extravagant outings for my nieces and nephews, insinuating that my love for my family should involve sacrificing for their pleasure. I refused. I set up independent trust funds for any future grandchildren and made the distributions contingent on education goals and behavioral contracts. The trust language was deliberately granular, funds dispersed for accredited tuition, not for luxury items. When Daniel learned this, he called me selfish. I told him on speakerphone, while my lawyer and trustee listened, that selfish, in this case, meant safeguarding the children's futures against impulsive spending. Silence carved into his voice again. As the months folded into a year, the dynamic shifted. Where they'd once looked at me with condescension, they now peered with a new measure uncertainty. And uncertainty is a weapon that far outlasts the flash of anger. Daniel, once the golden boy, found creditors and contractors calling. My parents, faced with the reality that their parental bragging had become public scrutiny, had to answer uncomfortable questions at the country club and at church. Invitations dwindled. People who once walked into rooms with their heads high now angled away. I won't pretend it felt good all the time. Late at night, after depositions and philanthropic committees and endless meetings with trustees, I sat alone, the house around me quiet, and wondered if I'd become the person I didn't like. There were moments, small, heartbreaking, when I heard the echo of my younger self asking for a hug and a note that said proud. In those moments, I'd call my therapist and untangle the threads, the cruelty they'd shown, the strategy I'd chosen, the real need to protect myself and my future children. Then, the twist I hadn't planned for, the moment that made everything complicated, arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when my mother came to me with tears and a confession. Not the kind where she simply admitted guilt. This was different. She sat on my living room couch, fingers knotted, and said, "Charlotte, there's something you should know about your father." She told me then that a line of family debts and secrets ran deeper than I'd imagined. My father, bless him for his bravado, had gambled on an unsound investment and had quietly borrowed against the house years ago. The house they thought would be the family jewel had leverage against it, liens and small, private agreements designed to stay out of sight. They'd been living on the edge, pretending stability. My parents had given Daniel the house because in their minds they were buying his future, and theirs. They'd never intended me to have anything because, absurdly, they'd convinced themselves I didn't need help. Their lies weren't just emotional, they were financial. When I heard that, the moral calculus shifted again. This wasn't a clean black and white of greedy parents versus righteous daughter, it was messy. My victory could ruin them. It could, and perhaps should, be tempered with mercy. I had to decide what kind of person I wanted to be. Up to that point, my actions had been a blend of self-defense and righteous fury. Now I stepped back and re-examined. I didn't fold, but I adapted. I offered a path to redemption that required accountability. I would help refinance the family's obligations, but only if my parents agreed to counseling, to stepping down from any positions where conflicts of interest had cropped up, and to public disclosure of the debts so the community could support and watch the reform. It wasn't a gift, it was a pact. They would have to show they could be trusted stewards of any help I gave. Daniel erupted with fury. How dare I attach conditions? And my relationship with him cratered further. But my parents, flung into the uncomfortable brightness of truth, signed the agreement. They wanted stability, and in a complicated human turn, they were willing to change enough to survive. They cried a lot, and I cried once with them because despite everything, they were still my parents and that didn't vanish because of greed or neglect. The final blow to the old order came quietly. The community, once cheerfully complicit in my parents' and brothers' narrative, now saw a woman who refused to be diminished. Boards passed conflict of interest policies. The scholarship fund was transparent. Vendors bid publicly. Daniel had to step down from a couple of committees where he'd been a lightning rod. He lost clients. He lost the easy luxury of being the golden boy. He also lost the smugness that had shielded him for years. On my end, I learned something fundamental. Revenge and justice live on a knife edge. When you win, you need to know what you've won. I could have burned the house to the ground metaphorically and watched them suffer. Instead, I used the money as a scalpel to excise the rot and to build an infrastructure that protected the vulnerable, students who didn't have parents who thought to buy them houses at Thanksgiving. I didn't need to humiliate them publicly every day to make my point. I needed to build something that rewired the way our family and our community valued support and transparency. There were still moments when family gatherings felt like minefields. There were nights when Daniel's glare found me across the room and I felt a pang of something like regret. But more often, there was a calm satisfaction, an inner steadiness that said, I will not be erased again. I put systems in place so my children, or if I had kids someday, would never inherit the chaotic favoritism that had once made me small. If you ask if I taught them a lesson, yes. I taught them that conditional love has consequences. I taught them that overlooking someone for years will change who that someone becomes. I taught them that money doesn't fix everything, structure and accountability do. And in the end, I taught myself the same lesson twice over. Power without wisdom is dangerous, but power with boundaries is protective. So I didn't dance on any graves. I opened doors that had been closed, shone light where there had been shadows, and built safety nets where there had been none. The revenge was not a single dramatic act. It was a long arc of restructuring, of making sure that the priorities would change, not because one woman was angry, but because the system around us demanded transparency. The applause was quiet. The victory was definitive.